The plate hit the floor half a second before Cora Finch could catch it, ceramic shards skidding across the polished marble of the Meridian Hotel's private dining room. And by the time she looked up, Vivica Strand was already pointing one perfect lacquered nail directly at her face and screaming that she'd just tried to kill him. Cora stood in the wreckage of a $240 entree, hand-pressed duck confit with a truffle reduction that had taken the kitchen 3 hours to prepare. Her white uniform shirt splattered with sauce, her chest heaving. She hadn't intended to grab the plate like that. She'd intended to say something calm, something professional. Instead, her body had moved before her brain caught up, and now 400 years of combined criminal pedigree was staring at her across a ruined dinner table. Remy Salcedo hadn't moved. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men would have flinched. He sat at the head of the table perfectly still, his dark eyes cutting from the destroyed plate to Cora's face with an expression she couldn't read. He was 42 years old and looked like someone had carved him out of something expensive and very hard. Silver threaded his dark hair at the temples, the kind of handsome that didn't ask your permission. He ran one of the most powerful organized crime networks in the Great Lakes corridor. He also owned the Meridian Hotel, which was how Cora had ended up here, on her knees in the ruins of his dinner, with a piece of porcelain embedded in her palm. "She's been acting strange all evening." Vivica's voice was perfectly pitched, high enough to sound hysterical, controlled enough to be believed. "I saw her hovering near the kitchen. I told you, Remy. I told you she couldn't be trusted. Look at her. Look at what she did." Vivica Strand was everything Cora was not, and she wanted everyone in the room to notice that fact simultaneously. She stood 6 feet in heels, wearing a crimson gown that had been fitted to a body that looked like it had been professionally maintained since birth. She was 34 years old and moved through the world with the authority of someone who had never once been told to use the service entrance. She'd been Remy's girlfriend for 8 months. In that time, she had made Cora's presence in any room feel like a personal offense. Earlier that evening, when Cora had come in to fold the dinner napkins, Vivica had looked her up and down with that particular expression. The slow scan that started at the feet and never quite made it to the face. "They really will send anyone up here," she'd said to no one in particular, loud enough for the whole room to absorb. Cora was 26 years old and weighed 270 pounds. She had been a housekeeper at the Meridian for 2 years, promoted to private event staff 6 months ago because she was meticulous and quiet and very good at being invisible. She had a round face that her mother called beautiful and that the world called irrelevant. Her uniform never quite fit right at the shoulders. She'd learned to ignore that. She'd also learned, growing up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, with a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital pharmacy, to pay attention to things other people overlooked. That was what had started this. 3 hours earlier, Cora had gone to the private kitchen to collect the bread service for the pre-dinner setup. The Meridian's private chef for VIP events was a small, exacting man named Morales, who had worked at the hotel for 11 years and who had a particular way of holding his knife, grip loose, wrist leading, that Cora had watched so many times she'd stopped consciously noticing it. The man standing at the station when she walked in was not holding the knife that way. He was holding it wrong. Small thing. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you'd watched Morales work for 2 years and memorized the shape of him without meaning to. This man was taller, broader, and kept his grip tight in a way that suggested he'd trained somewhere else entirely. He glanced at her when she came through the swinging door and then looked away with the practiced disinterest of someone pretending they hadn't noticed her. She'd almost let it go, almost. But on her way out, she passed the cold storage room at the end of the hall, and she heard, very faintly, something that sounded like knocking. She stopped, pressed her ear to the door. 2 sharp raps, a pause, 2 more. Pattern, deliberate. She tried the handle, locked. The keycard reader was blinking red. She stood there for 10 seconds with the breadbasket in her hands and did the math in her head. A man she didn't recognize in the kitchen. The real chef locked in storage. Tonight's dinner was for Remy Salcedo and his guest from the Delano family, an alliance dinner, the kind where the main course meant something more than food. She didn't know exactly what moved through Remy's supply routes or why this particular dinner mattered, but she knew enough about how power worked in this city to understand that disrupting a meeting like this served someone very specific. And then she thought about the pharmacy. 16 years old, working weekends at the Walgreens on 79th, learning to identify medication by shape and color and residue because her mother had insisted. Know what you're handling. You don't put things in people's bodies without knowing what they are. The white residue she'd seen on the cutting board next to the entree plates, fine, powdery, faintly iridescent, wasn't flour. It wasn't cornstarch. It was the kind of residue left by a pharmaceutical tablet that had been crushed and mixed into something wet. She'd seen it enough times to know the texture without being able to name what she was knowing. She'd thought about telling someone, the floor manager, security. But she was a housekeeper who'd been on private event staff for 6 months, and the man in the kitchen was authorized enough to be standing there, and Viveka was already watching her like a problem waiting to be documented. Who was going to believe her? Remy Salcedo had looked at her once, 3 weeks ago, when she'd brought a replacement towel set to the penthouse. He'd said, "Thank you." Just that. Not dismissively, not absently. Actually looked at her when he said it, the way people look at someone they've registered as a full human being. She'd thought about that more than she probably should have. So when the plate was set in front of him and she watched the sauce pool at the edge, that same faint iridescence she'd seen on the cutting board, her body made the decision before she did. Now she was on her knees in the ruins of his dinner, and Viveka was still screaming. She needs to be arrested. Viveka pressed her hand to Remy's arm. "Remy, call the police. She walked in here specifically too." "Enough." Remy's voice was quiet, not loud, it didn't need to be. The room went still. The Delano family's representative, a silver-haired man named Fitch, who had not spoken more than 12 words all evening, sat back in his chair and watched with the detached interest of someone waiting to see which direction a storm would break. Remy's head of security materialized from the far side of the room. His name was Torrance, and he was the size of a refrigerator and moved like smoke. He looked at Cora on the floor without hostility but without warmth. "Boss." "Take her to my office." Remy stood, buttoning his jacket. "Keep it quiet." "You need to call the police." Viveka's voice had gone sharp. "She's a hotel employee. This goes through proper channels, Remy, not through your." "This is my hotel, Viveka." He didn't look at her. "And this is my office, Torrance." Torrance didn't drag her. He helped her up by the elbow with a grip that was firm but not cruel, and walked her out through the service corridor, because the service corridor was faster and quieter. She could hear Viveka still talking as the door swung shut behind them. The office was on the 42nd floor, where the carpet cost more per square foot than Cora's monthly rent. She sat on a leather couch and pressed her hand over the piece of porcelain lodged in her palm and tried to breathe through it. The silence was enormous. She had time to think about how this ended. She was a housekeeper who had grabbed a crime boss's dinner plate out of his hands in front of witnesses. Viveka was already constructing the narrative. She'd watched that happen in real time. The way a skilled liar pivots. The way a story assembles itself around an audience's existing assumptions. The shape they'd reach for was obvious. Fat nobody, unstable, jealous, unhinged. Who would question it? She gave them something that fit perfectly. She thought about her mother getting off her hospital shift in 2 hours. She thought about Morales in that locked storage room and wondered if anyone had found him yet. The door opened 40 minutes later, not Torrance. Remy came in alone without his jacket, sleeves rolled to the forearm. He was carrying a first aid kit and a glass of water, which somehow made everything more frightening, not less. He sat down in the chair across from her, looked at her hand. "Let me see it." She held it out. He opened the kit without ceremony and picked up the tweezers, and she watched the most dangerous man in Chicago carefully extract a shard of porcelain from her palm with the kind of focused attention that suggested he'd learned careless hands make worse wounds. "Tell me what happened," he said. Not an order, a request that would not be repeated. So she told him. All of it. The man in the kitchen, the wrong grip, the knocking from behind the storage room door, the residue on the cutting board. She told him about the pharmacy, about her mother, about what crushed pharmaceutical tablets look like when they've been dissolved into a reduction sauce. She said she didn't know the specific compound, only that it was not food. She talked while he cleaned the wound and applied antiseptic, and she did not allow herself to cry because she was not going to cry in front of Remy Salcedo. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Morales," he said. "He was knocking, I heard him. I don't know if anyone." "He's out." Remy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Torrance found him 20 minutes ago. Whoever locked him in there used a staff access card." The silence that followed was very specific. Cora understood, without being told, what a staff access card meant in this context. "The dining room has cameras," he said, more to himself than to her. Then he looked up. "You noticed his knife grip." "Morales holds it differently." She heard how that sounded. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you pay attention." He applied the bandage in 2 clean strips and sat back. His eyes were direct, and she had the sense that he was running calculations she couldn't see. Viveka gave access authorization for tonight's kitchen staff. She said it was a last-minute dietary accommodation she'd forgotten to request. She used her card 40 minutes before service. He paused. "The access logs show it. So does the camera at the kitchen entrance." Cora went very still. The shape of it settled into place. All of it. The alliance dinner that would shift territory and money, along lines Cora didn't fully understand, but could see clearly enough from the outside. And Viveka, who had spent 8 months learning the architecture of Remy's world, and had finally found the joint she could pry. "She needed someone to blame," Cora said quietly, "and I was right there." He didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. "Why didn't you let it go?" He asked the question without accusation. He was watching her the way he'd watched the dining room downstairs, with the full attention of someone who was deciding something important. "You knew how it would look. You knew they'd come for you first." She thought about the honest answer before she gave it. "Because you said thank you." She looked at her bandaged hand. 3 weeks ago. The towels. You actually looked at me when you said it. Nobody up here does that." She met his eyes. "I don't know how to watch someone die because they were convenient." Something moved across his face. Not softness exactly, more like recognition of a specific kind. He stood, reached for his jacket. "There are people downstairs who need to see something," he said. "Can you walk back in there?" She thought about Viveka's finger pointing at her face. The way the word hysterical had already been loading in the room. The way her size made her a legible villain. In a story that people like Viveka had been telling forever, the bitter, unhinged woman, who couldn't possibly have a reason, only pathetic need. She stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady. She stood up anyway. The private dining room had changed shape in her absence. The ruined dinner had been cleared. Torrance stood near the wall with 2 of Remy's men. Fitch, the Delano representative, remained seated, still watching. still deciding. Viveka stood at the center of the room, composed again, surgical. She'd had 40 minutes to rebuild her performance. When the door opened and Cora walked in behind Remy, the performance cracked. Just for a second, a flash of something hot and calculating before the wounded outrage reassembled itself. She should not be in this room. Viveka's voice found its clarity. Remy, after what she did. Sit down, Viveka. The temperature dropped. Viveka did not sit, but she stopped talking, which was the more important thing. Remy walked to the wall-mounted screen at the far end of the room and touched a panel. The hotel's security feed appeared. Tisbrass, sharp resolution, clean angles. The first clip, kitchen entrance, 6:14 p.m., a man in chef's whites entering on a keycard swipe. The access log materialized in the corner of the frame in white text, Strand V. Viveka's chin lifted. That's clearly The second clip, cold storage corridor, Morales, the real chef, being guided through the storage room door by the same man, door closing, lock engaging. I don't know what that is supposed to. The third clip, the prep station. The angle caught the man's hands, and because the Meridian's kitchen had cameras positioned for food safety compliance, it caught the small glass vial being upended over the saucepan, the white powder dissolving into the dark reduction. Viveka stopped talking. The compound, Remy said, his voice entirely level, was identified by our contact 45 minutes ago. A high-dose cardiac glycoside. Enough to induce complete cardiac arrest in a healthy adult within 20 minutes of ingestion. It would have looked like a sudden heart attack. He paused. Convenient, given that my personal physician is across the city tonight. Fitch uncrossed his legs. His expression hadn't changed, but he was listening with his whole body now. The man you let into my kitchen works for the Dravek organization in Detroit, Remy said to Viveka. We confirmed that. You've been feeding them information about my roots. For how long? Viveka said nothing. Her composure was gone. What was underneath it was ugly and cornered and afraid. The Draveks promised you something, Remy continued. A position. Protection. After I was out of the picture. He tilted his head slightly. Did you think they'd actually honor that? And then Viveka stopped calculating and started screaming. Not the controlled performance from before, something raw and desperate. She turned on Cora with her whole body, stepping forward, and the words that came out of her were the kind that existed, specifically, to make a person feel like they were less than the floor beneath their feet. Every word she'd sharpened over 8 months of careful cruelty, deployed all at once. Cora let the words land. She didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She waited until Viveka ran out of breath. Then she looked at her and said, You almost killed a man with his own dinner. Quiet, just that. Viveka blinked. You chose me because you knew no one would question it, Cora said. You knew all you had to do was give this room a shape they already recognized, and they'd fill in the rest themselves. She didn't raise her voice. It didn't work. Fitch made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He rose from his chair, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Remy with an expression of dry assessment. Your house, he said. Handle it. He nodded once, at Remy, and then distinctly at Cora, and walked out with his 2 men behind him. The alliance was intact. That nod confirmed it. Torrance moved. He was efficient and quiet, and Viveka was out of the room in under 30 seconds. The door closed. Silence. Cora stood in it for a moment before her legs made a decision independent of her pride, and she sat down heavily in the nearest chair. The adrenaline was leaving. It took the warmth with it. Her hand throbbed. She was aware, suddenly, of how destroyed her uniform was. Sauce stains, a small tear at the sleeve where she'd caught herself on the table's edge going down. Remy crossed the room and sat on the edge of the table closest to her, not hovering, just present. You're going to need a new shirt, he said. A sound came out of her that was almost a laugh. I owe you an apology. Flat and clean, The way someone says something they mean without needing it performed. For the office, for the 40 minutes. You didn't know yet. I should have asked before I assumed. He was quiet for a moment. That's not how I operate, not usually. She looked at him. He was watching her the same way he had downstairs, with that quality of full attention she'd thought, 3 weeks ago, must have been a coincidence. Apparently it wasn't. What happens to her? Cora asked. The Dravik organization will know their contact was caught. That ends her usefulness to them. His voice was matter of fact. She made a play and it didn't land. In this world, that has consequences I don't need to arrange. She nodded. She understood, roughly, what that meant, and she chose not to follow the thread further. I want to offer you something, he said. A real position. Not housekeeping. He paused, measuring his words the same way he measured everything. I have people who handle logistics, security, operations. What I don't have is someone in my circle who sees what's wrong before it becomes a disaster. Someone who reads a room the way you read a room. She stared at him. You identified a hired impersonator by his knife grip, he said. You recognized pharmaceutical residue from a job you held at 16. You walked back into that dining room, knowing Viveka would use you as a target, and you walked in anyway. He tilted his head slightly. Those aren't accidents. That's a way of thinking. I'm a housekeeper. You were a housekeeper. He stood. What you are is something I'd like to stop wasting. The thing about offers from men like Remy Salcedo was that they came with full awareness of the weight attached. She wasn't naive about what his world was. She'd grown up in proximity to it, not inside it, but close enough to know the shape. She understood what she'd be walking toward. She also knew what she'd been walking through before tonight. 2 years of being looked through, of existing in rooms as a useful inconvenience, of being precisely as invisible as the people with power needed her to be so they could move through their lives without friction. Tell me more about what the job would look like, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more considered than that. There's a charity gala next week, my foundation. Come as a guest. We'll talk through it properly, over a meal I can personally guarantee was made by Morales, who is, as of tonight, receiving a significant salary increase. She thought about her mother on the south side, about the apartment with the heating unit that had never worked right, and the windows that let winter in through the seams. Okay, she said. 6 months later, Cora Finch sat at a round table in the Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom, wearing a dress the color of deep water, custom-made to her measurements. Remy had sent 3 options and said the green was the one, and she'd found, when she put it on, that he was right. The ballroom held 400 people, politicians, old money, newer money carefully laundered into the appearance of respectability, the kind of room that used to feel like a foreign country. It didn't feel foreign anymore. Marais was in the kitchen, alive, compensated, and apparently developing a new lamb preparation he'd promised to debut before spring. Cora had stopped by to see him on her way in, and he'd handed her a small plate of something with herbs and an expression that said, "Tell me the truth." She'd told him it was perfect. He'd accepted this with appropriate, professional dignity. Viveka Strand's name had not been spoken in this hotel in 6 months. Cora did not know exactly where she was, and had decided she didn't need to. Her mother had a new apartment now, 3 blocks from the old one, 2 bedrooms, a heating unit that worked, windows that sealed. She'd cried when she saw it, and then collected herself and said the kitchen tiles were the wrong color, which Cora had taken as a sign of full recovery. When Remy crossed the ballroom toward her, the crowd adjusted itself around him, the way crowds do around men who carry that particular kind of gravity. He sat down beside her, and his hand came to rest at the small of her back, a gesture that had become part of the architecture of being near him Over 6 months of long nights working through briefings and logistics and slow dinners where the work eventually stopped and the conversation didn't. When they stood to greet the room together, some people tried the old scan, old habit, old assumption, the slow look that started at the floor and decided everything before it reached the face. It landed differently now, not only because of the dress or the seat at the table or the man beside her. It landed differently because Cora Finch had walked back into a dining room 6 months ago with shaking legs and said 3 sentences in a quiet voice, and she had not been invisible since. She did not intend to be invisible again.